All right, so today we're going to dive into something that I think is uh, pretty critical, and that's cellular security.
Okay.
Um,
Mm.
we use our phones for everything these days, right?
Yeah.
Keeping in touch with family, navigating cities, even in like emergencies.
Right.
We really rely on those networks working flawlessly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But what if those networks weren't as secure as we thought?
Well, that's a good point to start with because I think we take for granted
Yeah.
how much we rely on these networks being completely operational.
Right.
And there was a recent research paper put out by the Florida Institute for Cybersecurity Research
Okay.
that kind of highlighted some pretty alarming findings. They looked at a bunch of different implementations of 4G and 5G core networks, so things like Open5GS, Magma, OpenAirInterface. Some of those are open source, some are commercially available.
Okay.
And they found over 100 vulnerabilities.
Over 100. Wow, that's a lot. So what kind of impact could these vulnerabilities actually have?
Well, they fall into two main categories. Some of them could lead to what we call persistent service disruption.
Right.
So imagine like a city, an entire city's cell service just goes down.
Oh, wow.
That's not just inconvenient, it could be really dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in an emergency or something like that.
Right, exactly.
That's a terrifying thought.
The other category is even more unsettling.
Okay.
Some of the vulnerabilities could potentially give attackers remote access into the core of a cellular network.
So, like what? Someone could be like snooping on our calls and texts or even tracking our location.
Well, it's not quite as simple as that,
Okay.
but it is a real possibility. And what's really concerning is the research team actually demonstrated a proof of concept exploit for what's called SD core.
Okay.
And they were able to achieve what's called remote code execution, which means that they could potentially control parts of the network.
Whoa, okay, now I'm officially freaked out. So who are these attackers and how could they actually exploit these vulnerabilities?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. You see, some of these vulnerabilities could be exploited by anyone with an unauthenticated mobile device. You don't even need a SIM card for some of them.
Oh, wow. So any random person with a phone could just like cause havoc.
Yeah.
That seems a bit far-fetched.
Well, not necessarily.
Oh.
Think about like the rise of Wi-Fi calling.
Yeah.
If you look at the diagram from cellularsecurity.org,
Okay.
you can see how an attacker connected to the internet could potentially exploit vulnerabilities through Wi-Fi calling. So it suddenly expands the attack surface drastically.
So it's not just about being like near a cell tower or something like that. It's like anyone, anywhere with an internet connection.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. That's
Yeah.
like a whole new level of vulnerability.
Yeah.
So it's not just theoretical. Like what about some of the more, I guess, attack scenarios? So like, let's say someone compromises a base station, right? Like especially those smaller femtocells that people use to boost their signal at home.
Right.
Is that something that's possible?
Well, it's certainly possible. It would require more effort, but it's not impossible.
Okay, so then what about like, let's say hacking into the network itself?
Well, that's also possible.
Yeah.
It requires a pretty high level of sophistication.
Right.
But imagine a scenario where someone was able to get access to what's called the IPsec network.
Okay.
That's used to secure the communications between different parts of the cellular network.
Right.
If that were compromised, the potential for damage would be enormous.
So, okay, I think we've established that these vulnerabilities are a big deal and that there are multiple ways that they could be exploited.
Right.
But what about the specifics? Like, what are some examples of these vulnerabilities?
Well, let's take a look at OpenAirInterface. That's a very popular platform for 5G networks.
Okay.
The researchers found a vulnerability. They've labeled it CVE 2024-24450
Okay.
that could allow an attacker to execute code remotely.
Oh, remote code execution. That sounds bad. What does that actually mean?
It means that they could potentially take control of parts of the system, maybe disrupt service, or even manipulate data.
Oh, man.
And that's just one example. They found a whole bunch more vulnerabilities in OpenAirInterface that could cause what's called a denial of service attack. So it would basically shut down parts of the network.
Wow. Denial of service attacks, remote code execution. It sounds like these vulnerabilities could have a major impact on our everyday lives.
They absolutely could. And I think what's important to remember is that these vulnerabilities now have official CVE IDs, which means that they've been recognized by the cybersecurity community and are being tracked.
Yeah, okay.
And that's a very crucial step in getting these issues fixed.
So it's not all bad news. At least these vulnerabilities are being taken seriously and addressed.
Exactly.
But before we get into more examples, I just want to be clear that we're sharing this information
Right.
for news reporting purposes only
Right.
and based on publicly available research. We're not cybersecurity experts ourselves.
Exactly. We're simply trying to shed light on this important issue and give you a better understanding of the potential impact.
Yeah.
And I think the researchers at the Florida Institute for Cybersecurity Research have done a fantastic job in uncovering these and responsibly disclosing them to the vendors.
And speaking of the research, you can find more information about it on their website, cellularsecurity.org. And hey, while you're at it, if you're enjoying this deep dive and want to hear more, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us grow and reach more people. And of course, a huge thank you to all of you who are already listening and supporting us.
Absolutely. We really appreciate your support. Now, let's get back to those vulnerabilities.
Okay.
We talked about OpenAirInterface, but there are other implementations like Open5GS and Magma that have their own set of issues.
Right.
We'll get into those next.
Okay, sounds good.
So welcome back to our deep dive into these cellular security vulnerabilities.
All right.
So far, we talked about the really critical role that cellular networks play.
Right.
And how those researchers from the Florida Institute for Cybersecurity Research actually found over 100 vulnerabilities in a bunch of these different implementations.
Yeah, and some of them are open source and some of them are commercial, right?
Exactly, both open source and commercially available.
Yeah, and we even touched upon some pretty unsettling possibilities like, a whole city's service going down,
Right.
or even like someone remotely getting access to the core of a network.
Exactly.
But those were just a few examples from OpenAirInterface.
Right.
What about these other implementations like Open5GS?
Well, with Open5GS, one of the things that stood out was how it handles user identities,
Okay.
particularly something called the SUCI. It's a really important part of the authentication process in 5G networks.
Okay, so if the SCCI is messed up, could that let someone, like, impersonate a legitimate user?
Not quite. What the researchers found is that if an attacker sent, like, malformed SSI data, it could actually crash the system. It's kind of like sending a garbled message that confuses the network so badly it just shuts down.
So more of a denial of service situation then,
Precisely.
but still disruptive.
Yeah, absolutely. And they found other vulnerabilities in Open5GS, too.
Okay.
Some related to how it handles what are called ISON configuration transfers.
CM configuration transfers.
Yeah, they're used to, like, manage and optimize the network.
Okay, so an attacker might not just disrupt service, they could potentially manipulate how the network operates.
That's the implication, yeah.
Wow.
It really highlights how complex these systems are and how many potential points of failure there are.
Right. You mentioned Magma earlier.
Yes.
Is that another 5G implementation?
It is, and the researchers found some pretty serious vulnerabilities there, too.
Really? Like what?
Well, one involves something called an out-of-bounds read vulnerability.
Out of bounds read.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of technical. Can you break that down for us non-experts?
Sure, so imagine, like, a library where all the books are carefully organized on shelves. Okay.
An out of bounds read would be like someone trying to grab a book from a shelf that doesn't exist.
Right.
It can cause all sorts of chaos because the system is trying to access information that's not there.
Okay. So it's like the system gets confused and just breaks down.
Exactly, yeah.
Did they find any other types of vulnerabilities in Magma?
Yeah, they found a whole bunch of issues related to what are called reachable assertions
Okay.
in the NGAP protocol, which is a key part of 5G.
Okay, I gotta admit, I'm a bit lost on the technical jargon.
All right.
What does that mean in simpler terms?
Think of assertions like safety checks built into the system.
Right.
They're supposed to make sure everything is running smoothly.
Right.
But if an attacker can trigger these checks inappropriately, it can cause the system to become unstable or even crash.
So it's like setting off a bunch of false alarms
That's exactly.
that disrupt the whole operation.
Very good analogy.
Okay, cool.
And remember, these are just a few examples from the 5G side of things.
Researchers also found a whole bunch of vulnerabilities in the implementations of LTE.
Oh, right, that older 4G technology.
Yeah, the one that many of us still use.
So no matter what generation of cellular network we're on, it seems like there are potential vulnerabilities.
That's right.
Wow. And what's even more concerning is that some of these LTE vulnerabilities affect how the system handles emergency calls.
Exactly.
Oh, wow. So not only could an attacker disrupt regular service, but they could potentially interfere with 911 calls.
Yeah.
Oh, that's scary.
It really underscores the importance of addressing these vulnerabilities, and thankfully, the researchers followed what are called responsible disclosure practices.
Okay.
They gave the vendors time to patch these issues
Yeah.
before going public with their findings.
So that's reassuring at least. So while there are these serious vulnerabilities,
Right.
steps are being taken to fix them.
Exactly. And it's important to note that all of these vulnerabilities have been assigned official CVE IDs.
CVE IDs, remind me what those are again.
They're unique identifiers given to specific vulnerabilities. It's kind of like a fingerprint for a security flaw.
Oh, okay.
It helps researchers and vendors track them,
Right.
communicate about them,
Right.
and ultimately get them fixed.
So it's kind of like a centralized system for addressing vulnerabilities.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It helps ensure that everyone's on the same page when it comes to fixing these issues.
Exactly. And speaking of getting everyone on the same page, before we wrap up this part,
Yeah.
I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about responsible disclosure.
Right. The fact that the researchers gave the companies who made these systems
Yeah.
time to fix the problems before making them public.
Exactly. That's crucial because it allows for a smoother patching process
Right.
and it minimizes potential disruptions. It also prevents malicious actors from exploiting these vulnerabilities before they're addressed.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
It kind of shows that even in the world of cybersecurity research,
Right.
there's a strong ethical component to how things are done.
Absolutely. Responsible disclosure is a cornerstone of what's called ethical hacking and cybersecurity research.
Right.
Now, let's move on to some of the specific vulnerabilities that researchers found in LTE implementations.
Okay. So welcome back to the show. We've been talking about all these cellular security vulnerabilities,
Right.
and I got to say, it's been pretty eye-opening.
Yeah.
We've seen how these vulnerabilities affect both, 4G and 5G implementations.
Yeah.
And it seems like no system is totally immune.
It's true. And I think, as we've discussed, the complexity of these networks just inherently makes them challenging to secure.
Yeah.
And you have this rapid pace of innovation, new features, new technologies being added constantly.
Yeah.
And sometimes security considerations can kind of lag behind.
Right. It's like trying to build a skyscraper while the ground's still shaking,
It's a great analogy.
Yeah, there's only so much you can do.
In this final part, why don't we focus on OpenAirInterface's LTE implementation?
Okay.
Remember, LTE is that older 4G technology that many of us still use.
So even though 5G is getting all the hype, these 4G vulnerabilities are still relevant.
Absolutely. I mean, millions of devices are still using LTE networks,
Right.
and these vulnerabilities could have a big impact.
Okay.
The researchers uncovered several issues related to something called the GTP protocol in OpenAirInterface's implementation.
GTP, that rings a bell.
Huh.
It's that data delivery truck we talked about earlier, right?
Mhm.
One that carries those information packets across the network.
That's exactly it, yeah.
Okay.
One of the vulnerabilities they found involves the TEED field in GTP packets.
Okay.
Think of it as like the address label on those data packages.
Right, okay.
What they discovered is that if the TEED has a very specific value, it can cause the system to just crash completely.
So it's like sending a package to a non-existent address.
Yeah,
And the whole delivery system breaks down.
that's the idea.
Huh.
While triggering this vulnerability might not be easy,
Yeah.
it's still a concern that needs to be addressed.
Okay, so one bad address label can cause havoc.
Right.
What other GTP-related issues did they find?
Well, another one involves how the system handles IP address TLV values.
Okay, TLV, that stands for type length value, right?
Yeah.
And it's like a way of organizing the information
Exactly.
within those data packages.
Like different compartments within the delivery truck,
Right, okay.
each holding a specific type of information.
Gotcha.
What they found is that if the length of the IP address TLV is unexpected,
Okay.
it kind of throws the system off.
Right.
It could lead to unpredictable behavior, maybe a crash, a freeze, or even leak some sensitive information.
So it's like trying to fit a square package into a round compartment. It just doesn't work.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And remember, these are just two examples of GTP-related vulnerabilities. The researchers found many more issues
Right.
in OpenAirInterface's LTE implementation, including those pesky buffer overflows, out-of-bounds reads, problems with how specific messages and protocols are handled.
Okay, so there's a lot of work to do to make these systems more secure.
Yeah,
It's kind of overwhelming to think about.
it can be. But, it's important to remember that knowledge is power.
Right.
The fact that these vulnerabilities have been discovered and
Yeah.
have been disclosed responsibly
Right.
is a very positive step.
Right.
It lets vendors fix these issues
Yeah.
and make our networks more resilient.
It's like getting a health checkup, you know?
Mm,
Might not be fun, but it's essential for long-term well-being.
exactly.
Yeah.
And as we've emphasized throughout this whole deep dive,
Right.
all of these vulnerabilities now have CVE IDs.
Right.
This means they're being officially tracked and addressed by the whole cybersecurity community.
So it's not just like a bunch of researchers shouting into the void.
Right.
There's an actual system in place
Exactly.
to deal with these issues.
Yeah.
Okay, that's reassuring
And it highlights the importance of collaboration and information sharing. Yeah.
in the cybersecurity world.
Well, this deep dive into cellular security vulnerabilities has been quite a journey.
Yeah, it has.
It's made me think twice about how much we rely on these networks.
I think that's a really valuable takeaway. We often take for granted how crucial these technologies are to our everyday lives, and it's important to be aware of these potential risks.
Right. And from, denial of service attacks to remote code execution,
Right.
the potential consequences of these vulnerabilities are significant.
Absolutely.
And it affects everyone, from individuals to businesses to critical infrastructure.
Indeed. But remember, there are things we can do. We can stay informed about these issues, keep our devices and our software updated, and be cautious about connecting to unknown Wi-Fi networks.
Great advice. And if you want to learn more about this research and how to protect yourself, be sure to visit cellularsecurity.org. They've got a ton of great information there.
And with that, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Hopefully, you found it insightful and engaging. Absolutely. It's been fascinating and, at times, slightly terrifying look into the world of cellular security. Before we wrap up, I will give a big shout out to all our listeners out there.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate your support. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. It helps us reach a wider audience and spread awareness about these important issues. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.